I kept staring at the property records like they might suddenly apologize for what I was reading. Parcel map, legal description, boundary lines. My name printed exactly where it had always been. Nothing had changed. No amendments. No new easements. No signatures. No documents giving anyone permission to redraw anything. On paper, the land was still mine. Outside, bright orange ribbons were telling a different story. That disconnect is what really unsettled me. It's one thing to get a confusing HOA letter. It's another thing to see physical proof that someone had already decided the situation was settled without you. I printed everything: deed, purchase agreement, survey from closing day, the county parcel map. I spread the pages across my kitchen table like puzzle pieces, trying to make them tell a story that made sense. But every document kept repeating the same quiet truth. My property had never been part of the homeowners association, which meant the HOA expansion wasn't just aggressive. It felt premature, like they had skipped a step, or several. I started replaying the past few months in my head, looking for clues I might have missed. There had been construction at the edge of the neighborhood, new sidewalks, fresh landscaping, a small playground that seemed to appear almost overnight. Neighbors had mentioned the HOA was improving the community and boosting property values. At the time, it sounded harmless. Nice, even. I remember thinking how lucky I was to enjoy the quiet benefits of nearby upgrades without being part of the HOA rules. Now that memory felt different, heavier, because those upgrades had been moving closer and closer to my fence line, and apparently beyond it. I grabbed my phone and walked outside again, this time slower, more deliberate. The kind of walk you take when you're trying not to jump to conclusions, but your gut is already sprinting ahead. The stakes marked a neat, straight path cutting several feet into my backyard. Whoever placed them hadn't done it casually. This wasn't guesswork. It was measured, planned, and very intentional. I crouched near one of the stakes and noticed the ground had been freshly disturbed. The soil was darker, loose. This hadn't been there long. Days, maybe. That meant the timeline was recent. Urgent, quiet, and suddenly a new question surfaced, the kind that keeps you awake at night. How long had the HOA been planning this? I went back inside and searched through old emails, neighborhood newsletters, anything remotely connected to the HOA. Most of it was the usual: seasonal reminders, community events, landscaping updates. Then I found a newsletter from 6 months earlier. Buried halfway down the page was a sentence that made my chest tighten. Future community boundary enhancements are under review. Boundary enhancements. At the time, those words sounded vague and harmless. Now, they sounded like a warning I'd missed. The realization hit slowly but hard. This hadn't happened overnight. The HOA expansion had been moving forward quietly, step by step, while I had no idea I was even part of the conversation. Or worse, not part of it at all. I imagined meetings happening in warm conference rooms, maps spread across tables, decisions made with nods and signatures, discussions about shared spaces, property value growth, and community alignment. And somehow, my land had turned into a blank space on their map. That thought stayed with me as the sun climbed higher, lighting up the orange ribbons like tiny flags marking territory. The visual was impossible to ignore. It felt symbolic, like someone had quietly redrawn the line between mine and theirs and hoped I wouldn't notice until the bill arrived. But the bill had arrived. And now the question wasn't whether the HOA thought they could include my property. The real question was how far they were willing to go to make it stick. The first response from the HOA arrived 2 days after I sent my email asking a simple question. Can you explain why my property has been marked as part of your expansion? It wasn't an explanation. It was an invoice. A polished PDF with a logo at the top and a neat table of numbers beneath it. Monthly duas. Late fee policy. Payment portal link. The tone was calm, professional, and completely certain that I already belonged to them. No greeting. No acknowledgement of my question. Just a bill. I remember sitting there staring at it, feeling that strange mix of disbelief and anger that comes when someone skips straight past the conversation and jumps to the conclusion. It felt less like a mistake and more like momentum, like a machine that had already started moving and wasn't planning to stop. That's when the idea of charging them per square foot first crossed my mind. Not as a plan. Not yet. Just a spark of stubborn logic trying to keep up with the situation. If they believed they could claim my land without permission, what stopped me from billing them for using it? The thought felt petty at first, almost childish. I closed the laptop and tried to walk it off, pacing through the house like motion might organize my thoughts. But the more I replayed everything, the less petty it felt. Because this wasn't about money anymore. It was about precedent. If I ignored the invoice, would the fees stack up? Would unpaid dues become penalties? Legal notices. The stories I'd heard about HOA disputes started resurfacing, each one sounding less dramatic and more like a possible future. And that fear brought a new problem into the story: doubt. I hate confrontation. I'm the kind of person who rewrites emails 5 times before sending them. The kind who apologizes when someone else bumps into me. The idea of pushing back against an organized group with rules, committees, and lawyers felt overwhelming. For a moment, the easiest path seemed obvious. Just pay the dues and avoid the stress. The thought lingered longer than I'd like to admit. That's the part one didn't expect. The quiet pressure. Not threats, not aggression. Just paperwork and confidence slowly nudging me toward compliance. It made me wonder how many people had ended up in similar situations and chosen the path of least resistance simply because fighting felt exhausting. But then my neighbor Mark knocked on my door. He had seen the survey stakes too. Mark had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else on our street. Retired, observant, and the unofficial keeper of local history. He didn't waste time with small talk. They did the same thing on the east side last year, he said. Those words shifted everything. He explained how the HOA had expanded toward a row of homes near the park. Most homeowners eventually joined after negotiations and adjustments, but the process had been messy. Meetings, letters, long discussions about shared amenities and property value increases. He remembered the tension, the confusion, the quiet frustration. What happened to the people who said no? I asked. Mark hesitated just long enough to make the silence feel heavy. They stopped saying no. That answer stayed with me long after he left, because it didn't sound like a victory story. It sounded like a slow surrender. That night, I opened the HOA invoice again and read every line carefully. The language was precise, formal, confident in a way that suggested this process wasn't new to them. The structure felt rehearsed, like a script they had used before. And buried in the fine print was a sentence that made my pulse spike. Failure to comply may result in further action to ensure community alignment. Further action. For words that managed to say everything and nothing at the same time. I stared at the phrase, imagining all the possible meanings hiding behind it. Legal action. Property claims. Endless notices. It was vague enough to be harmless and threatening at the same time. That ambiguity was the most unsettling part. For the first time, the situation felt bigger than a boundary line, bigger than a monthly fee. It felt like a test of how far pressure could go before someone pushed back. I opened a blank document and started drafting something I never imagined writing. An invoice. Not emotional, not angry, just numbers, measurements, square footage. A calm, professional request for compensation for the use of privately owned land. The irony wasn't lost on me, but as I typed, a new thought crept in, one that felt equal parts empowering and terrifying. What if sending this made everything escalate? Because once you send an invoice like that, the conversation changes. And deep down, I had a growing suspicion the HOA had been expecting resistance all along. I didn't send the invoice right away. It sat in my drafts for 2 full days. Every time I opened it, my finger hovered over the mouse like it weighed 10 pounds. I reread every word, every number, every line that made the situation feel real in a way my brain still struggled to accept. Private land usage fee, unauthorized property inclusion, rate calculated per square foot. It looked absurd and somehow completely reasonable at the same time. The HOA had sent me a bill as if ownership could be updated with a newsletter and a set of survey stakes. My invoice simply mirrored their logic back to them. Still, Pressing send felt like stepping onto a road with no exit. I paced the living room, sat down, stood up again, checked the window like the orange ribbons might disappear if I waited long enough. They didn't. That afternoon, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. Not an email this time. Physical mail. Thick paper. Official letterhead. My pulse started climbing before I even opened it. Inside was a welcome packet. A welcome packet. Community guidelines. Amenity access information. Trash pickup schedule. A cheerful letter about joining a growing and thriving neighborhood. It was polished, friendly, carefully worded, and completely surreal. They hadn't answered my question. They hadn't acknowledged my email. They had simply moved forward as if the outcome was already decided. Momentum again. That word kept coming back. The packet included a printed map. Full color, glossy, and there it was, the new boundary line. Clean, sharp, confident, cutting straight through my property. Seeing it printed made my chest tighten in a way the survey stakes hadn't. Stakes could be moved. Paint could fade. But this map looked permanent. Official. Like something already presented in meetings and approved in minutes. I flipped the page and froze. At the bottom was a timeline. Phase 1, community perimeter expansion, completed. Phase 2, property alignment and onboarding, in progress. Phase 3, shared infrastructure integration, upcoming. Upcoming. That word landed hard. Infrastructure meant sidewalks, lighting, landscaping, maybe fencing. Permanent en change. The kind that don't quietly disappear if a mistake gets corrected later. They weren't just planning to include my land. They were planning to build on it. My hands started moving before my brain caught up. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, walking the fence line faster than before. The air felt different now. Charged. Like something invisible was already moving. Halfway down the yard, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny neon flags. Yellow this time. Pushed into the ground in a curved pattern that didn't match the straight survey stakes. Smaller. Closer together. Utility markings. My stomach dropped. I didn't need to be an expert to understand what that meant. Someone had called for underground lines to be marked. Gas. Electric. Water. Internet. The invisible systems that make construction possible. Construction that hadn't been mentioned once in any email. The timeline flashed in my head again. Phase 3. Shared infrastructure integration. Upcoming. The word felt louder now. I snapped photos of everything. Stakes, flags, the map from the packet laid against the fence for comparison. Evidence. Proof. My camera roll filling with images I never expected to collect in my own backyard. When I went back inside, the draft invoice was still open on my laptop. Waiting. I read it one more time. Slowly. Carefully. The fear was still there, but something new had joined it. Urgency. The kind that pushes hesitation aside, because doing nothing suddenly feels riskier than doing something. I pressed send. The whoosh of the email leaving my outbox felt louder than it should have. Final. Irreversible. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The house was quiet. The same ordinary afternoon light spilled across the kitchen floor. It felt impossible that anything had changed. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times. Voicemail. A second later, another buzz. An email notification. Sender. HOA Legal Department. My heartbeat started counting seconds before I even opened it. The message was short, professional, direct. They had received my invoice. They requested a meeting. In person. This week. And at the very bottom, one final line. Please bring any documentation you believe supports your claim. Supports your claim. Not your question. Not your concern. Your claim. The conversation had officially changed. And for the first time, the confrontation wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a date. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. 3 days away. 72 hours that suddenly felt too short and too long at the same time. I spent the next evening building a folder. Not a messy stack of papers, a clean, organized tab folder. Property deed, original survey, purchase agreement, county parcel map, photos of the stakes, photos of the utility flags, a printed copy of my invoice. If this was going to be a confrontation, I wanted everything calm, factual, and impossible to dismiss. The preparation felt strangely grounding, like building a shield out of paper, until Mark knocked on my door again. He didn't step inside this time, just stood on the porch with that same careful expression he'd worn before. "I heard they called you in," he said. The word "heard" caught my attention immediately. "Ow?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. "There was a community meeting last night." My stomach tightened. I hadn't been invited to any meeting. Mark explained that the HOA had presented a progress update about the boundary expansion. Slides, maps, timelines, plans for lighting and walking paths that would connect the outer properties to shared spaces. He said it sounded polished, confident, already decided. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. "What did they say about my property?" I asked. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, eyes drifting toward the street like the answer might be written there. "They said the remaining parcel owner was cooperating." The sentence didn't make sense at first. My brain rejected it before it even fully processed the words. Cooperating. I hadn't agreed to anything. I hadn't signed anything. My last communication with them was an invoice. And suddenly, the timeline in the welcome packet made a terrifying kind of sense. Phase 1, completed. Phase 2, in progress. They weren't waiting for permission. They were presenting progress. That realization shifted something deep inside me. Up until that moment, part of me still believed this could be a misunderstanding, an overstep that would be corrected once the right documents were placed in front of the right people. But presenting me as cooperating wasn't a mistake. It was a narrative, and it had already been shared with the entire neighborhood. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept replaying the phrase in loops. Cooperating, cooperating, cooperating. Every repetition made it feel less like miscommunication and more like strategy. Morning arrived too quickly, and with it came the second twist. A certified letter. The return address was the county office. My hands felt strangely steady opening it, like my brain had entered a calm before the storm mode. Inside was a formal notice regarding a pending infrastructure permit review connected to the HOA's expansion project. I read the first paragraph twice, then a third time. The permit included proposed utility work, pathway installation, and shared drainage improvements. Shared drainage. The words hit differently than the rest. Colder, heavier, because drainage doesn't stay politely inside boundary lines. Water flows where gravity tells it to. Changing drainage means changing land, changing elevation, soil, flow, changing the way the land behaves. And buried halfway down the notice was a sentence that made everything feel suddenly urgent. Adjacent property owners are encouraged to attend a review session if they have concerns. Adjacent property owners, not included owners. Adjacent. The shift in wording was subtle but powerful. In the HOA meeting, I was cooperating. In the permit notice, I was adjacent. Two completely different roles depending on the audience. Two different versions of reality moving forward at the same time. That's when the timeline snapped into focus in a way that made my chest feel tight. The meeting with the HOA wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was happening before the permit review, before the county looked at concerns, before anything official could slow the process down. Suddenly, the urgency made sense. The welcome packet, the invoice, the meeting request, the narrative of cooperation. They weren't just expanding, they were accelerating. And Thursday at 10 a.m. wasn't just a conversation. It was the last moment before the story became permanent. Thursday arrived faster than I wanted. The HOA office sat at the edge of the neighborhood, in a small building I'd driven past hundreds of times without ever noticing. That morning it looked different, sharper, like a place that had quietly been waiting for this moment long before I knew it existed. I sat in the car for a full minute before getting out, folder resting on the passenger seat like a silent passenger. The kind that doesn't comfort you, just reminds you what you're carrying. Inside, the room was already set up. A long table, 3 people, laptops open, papers stacked neatly. The atmosphere wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It felt prepared. They greeted me politely, offered water, thanked me for coming. Then they opened with the same calm tone I'd seen in every email. "We understand you have concerns about the boundary alignment. Concerns. I slid the folder onto the table and opened it slowly. The deed went down first, then the survey, then the parcel map. Each document placed carefully between us like stepping stones across a river. "This is my property," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "It has never been part of the HOA." They exchanged a quick glance. Not surprised, not defensive, just measured. One of them turned their laptop toward me and pulled up a digital map. The same clean boundary line I'd seen in the welcome packet. My backyard, shaded in the same color as the rest of the HOA land. "We're aware of the historical boundary," she said. Our expansion plan anticipated questions. Anticipated. The word hung in the air like a quiet admission. I pushed the photos forward next. Survey stakes, utility flags, the permit notice, the timeline from their own packet. Each piece of evidence laid out until the table looked like two competing versions of reality facing each other. Silence stretched. Then I placed my invoice on top of everything. "If you're charging me dues for land you've claimed," I said, "I'm charging you for the land you're using." For the first time, the calm cracked. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No slammed hands. Just a shift in posture. A pause that lasted a second too long. The moment when the script stopped matching the conversation. They asked for a break. 5 minutes. I sat alone at the table, staring at the documents, listening to muffled voices through the wall. The adrenaline started to fade, leaving behind that strange quiet clarity that comes after you finally said the thing you were afraid to say. When they came back, the tone had changed. Softer. Slower. They explained the expansion had been based on an outdated planning document. A decades-old proposal showing a future neighborhood layout that had never fully materialized. Over the years, leadership changed. Records were digitized. Maps were updated and re-updated. And somewhere along the way, the planned boundary had quietly become the assumed boundary. Assumed, repeated, presented, approved. Momentum. The word returned one last time. They admitted the permit application had relied on the same incorrect map. The meeting presentations, too. The welcome packet. The invoice. All of it built on a plan that had slowly transformed into reality, simply because it had been referenced often enough. No one had gone back to the original deed records until my invoice forced them to. The room went quiet again. Then came the words I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath for. They were withdrawing the expansion over my property. No duas. No construcción. No boundary change. The relief didn't hit all at once. It arrived slowly, like tension draining from muscles you forgot were clenched. We shook hands. Calmly. Professionally. The meeting ended without drama. It felt finished, until the final document slid across the table. A revised map. My property clearly outside the HOA boundary again. And just beneath it, a highlighted note. Expansion area reduced by 3,200 square feet. My square footage. They hadn't just corrected the mistake. They had redesigned the entire expansion plan around the space they could no longer claim. On the drive home, the orange ribbons were already gone. By evening, the utility flags had disappeared too. The backyard looked exactly the way it had a week ago. Like nothing had ever happened. But now I knew how close it had come to changing forever. The quiet felt different after that week. Not the peaceful, ordinary quiet I'd grown used to. This one felt earned. Like the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for days. I walked the fence line again that evening. The same path I'd paced over and over while the stakes and flags were still there. Now the ground looked untouched. The soil settled back into place, as if the land had quietly reclaimed its own story. For the first time in days, I didn't feel the urge to take photos. I just stood there. It's strange how fast a place can start to feel uncertain when someone questions your ownership of it. Nothing physical had changed inside the house during that week, but everything had felt different. The kitchen table became a workspace. The living room turned into a pacing track. The backyard stopped feeling like a backyard and started feeling like a boundary. Now it felt like home again. Mark stopped by later that evening. This time he came in, accepted a cup of coffee, and listened as I told him how the meeting ended. He nodded slowly, like the outcome surprised him and didn't surprise him at the same time. They move fast when paperwork gets involved, he said. We both knew what he meant. Momentum works both ways. The neighborhood newsletter arrived the following week. A short update. Polite. Neutral. It mentioned revisions to the expansion plan following a property review. No drama. No details. Just a quiet correction folded into the normal flow of community updates. The narrative had shifted again, and this time I was fine with the silence. The county permit notice followed a few days later, a simple confirmation that the infrastructure proposal had been amended. My property wasn't part of the review anymore. The process continued, just without crossing my fence line. That was the part that stayed with me the most. The expansion didn't stop. The HOA didn't disappear. The neighborhood kept growing, just like it was always going to. The only thing that changed was the boundary of where it stopped. And that boundary mattered more than I ever realized. Looking back, the hardest part of the whole experience wasn't the emails or the meeting or even the invoice. It was the quiet pressure to go along with something simply because it seemed inevitable, because it looked official, because it felt easier than pushing back. That's the part one almost gave into. I almost paid the dues. I almost stayed silent. I almost let momentum decide something that should have required permission. And that realization still gives me chills. Because this story was never really about an HOA dispute or property lines or survey stakes. It was about attention, about asking questions, about what happens when you slow down a process that expects you not to. Sometimes the biggest conflicts don't start with confrontation. They start with an assumption that no one will challenge the plan. Standing in the backyard that night, the sky fading into evening, I kept thinking about how close the story had come to ending differently. How easily the timeline could have kept moving forward without me ever stepping into the conversation. The land didn't change, but I did. I learned that ownership isn't just paperwork in a folder. It's awareness. It's speaking up when something feels off. It's refusing to confuse confidence with correctness. And maybe the biggest lesson of all was this. Just because something looks official doesn't mean it's final. If this story made you think, pause, or question something in your own life, share it with someone who needs the reminder. Because sometimes the smallest voice is the one that stops the biggest change. And sometimes protecting what's yours starts with a single sentence. Can you explain this?